ReFed is a environmental advocacy organization, which uh, I've known about for a couple of years. They're really the leader in food waste in the United States, in bringing this issue to the forefront, and then being um, the leader of bringing everybody together, kind of all different sectors, government, nonprofit, for profit, science. They want to bring everyone who's interested in food waste together, and I met them a couple of years ago, kind of read their work and called them up and said, "I think we should talk. There's Lyd has something to say here in this conversation," and they were receptive. And in 2024, we did a project with them, some research papers, and then in 2025, we've embarked on a very large research project, which we're all working on. This is I say a sprawling project. Has a bunch of different parts to it and a very large question. So, the one of the core pieces is to redo the numbers related to manufacturing and distribution in what they call their food waste monitor. ReFed has a very snazzy website with a lot of data, and they are looked to as an authoritative source of information about food waste in the United States. And they have a model where they have five sectors: the farming or agricultural sector, manufacturing, retail, by which they mean grocery stores, food service, by which they mean restaurants, and then home consumption, and people's houses. And they've asked us to look at that manufacturing sector and to expand it out to include distribution, to provide new numbers on the total amount of food that is manufactured and produced in the United States, how much loss there is, and to look at that in each of their different food types, and to understand why that loss happens, what are the causes, where does that um, food loss or waste go, and what are solutions that could be implemented by manufacturers or distributors to reduce that waste. So there's a lot of questions in there. It
Very easy, very easy
Yeah,
ask.
yeah, exactly. And it's supposed to cover every food type in the United States food market. So it's a really big question. And I sometimes think this is an almost unmeasurable question, but our challenge is to measure the unmeasurable and to put a number to it, and boil down a very complicated system into a couple of key numbers.
Mhm,
Yeah. So you guys are really involved in trying to figure out how to do that measurement.
mhm.
Um, I'll say, Danny, maybe we'll start. We'll talk about the denominator and then we'll talk about the numerator.
Mhm.
So this big equation. So Danny, maybe ask you about how are you going about figuring out the total amount of food that is manufactured and distributed in the United States.
Absolutely. So, um, just to add to that a little bit more too, we've been asked to focus especially on really two food types, right? One which is meat and seafood, and then there's dairy and eggs, right? The reason why we've been asked to look at these in particular is because these tend to be a bit more expensive and to have a much larger impact on climate emissions compared to other food types, and so there's extra focus on that. But then to answer your question about how we're approaching the denominator versus the numerator, right? Really, it's a lot of research, right? We're looking for repeatable data sources, and most of what we're finding is from the USDA, from organizations such as the USDA, NOAA, and just other governmental organizations that are really good at reporting a lot of data on a consistent basis. So it's been a lot of just trying to wrangle this together, talking with different
Right.
experts, reaching out to different members of those organizations as well, and trying to understand how to navigate all the different tables they have and
Right.
all the work they're reporting.
Yes. And how to get those different data sources to accurately, as best we can, represent the manufacturing sector in the US, which is a very complicated sector. Gina, you're focused more on the numerator, I would say, which is the loss and how to measure how much
Yeah,
their loss there is in every category. How are you going about that?
yes. We've been conducting interviews with manufacturers and distributors to try and understand their loss rates. So, broken down as well by each stage of their operations. So we kind of walk them through from their receiving stage, like inbound receiving goods, the loss that happens there. Then we go through to the production line for manufacturers. Obviously, it doesn't apply to distributors. Then the loss that happens in their warehouse, and then their loss rates from their returns. So we walk through each stage of those operations, and we also ask them about the causes of loss and waste that happens at each of those stages and the destinations, because we're going to try and quantify those things as well to understand the largest causes of loss and waste per different food category, and how it differs for different companies and different food categories, and then how they're managing it as well. So by asking them about their destinations, whether they donate a lot of food, whether they practice composting, or giving it to animal feed, for example, upcycling becoming popular. Um, yeah, so it's a lot of interviewing different companies, and we're going to be as well trying to pull from the literature where there are good loss rates in the literature as well.
Gina, I think you've been doing, I think most of the interviews, if not all of the interviews with the different
Yeah.
companies. Have you noticed any interesting trends or patterns across them?
For sure, we've noticed that the loss rates really depend on the type of product that a company is making. It's far easier for a company that's producing a kind of shelf stable, non perishable item to rework product, or because it has a longer shelf life, less likely to encounter difficulties managing rotation and expiry dates and things like that. Um, so for companies like fresh produce um, packers and processors and manufacturers, probably more likely to encounter higher loss rates. Um, Distributors we've seen often are working with really tiny percentages,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
predictable.
There isn't a lot of loss. I mean, that's the thing is that I mentioned Refed's 5 different sectors earlier. Manufacturing is the sector with the least amount of waste when you compare it to the other ones they are looking at. That doesn't mean there's no waste, but there's not a ton. And then if you just focus down on distribution, there's really it's pretty little. But you're talking about a small percentage, but of a very, very,
Mhm.
very large denominator. Like there's a lot of food in the United States. So, um, yeah, I think with distributors, we found damages is one, the thing that a lot of people have cited, just, cases dropped, crushed for various reasons. So they've talked a lot about kind of good warehouse practices and how you take good care of your product, so in the warehouse and in the trucks and the transportation side so that it doesn't get crushed. And then also expiration, and the rotation that Gina mentioned, that's kind of another place that distributors can get tripped up, and they've talked definitely about the software and the importance of software in tracking inventory, to make sure that it gets used appropriately. Um, yeah, those have been some themes certainly on the distribution side.
Yeah,
Manufacturing is really quite varied, yeah, depending on
yeah. It
what
depends on the
types.
size as well of the
Mhm.
manufacturer too, I think. I've been really encouraged to see how many people we've spoken to are donating.
Mhm.
They often have relationships with local food banks.
Yes. I mean, everyone's very conscientious. No one is wasting food, like, uh, indiscriminately.
Mhm.
Everyone is trying not to waste it and to get it to people or maybe animals, who could eat it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think
Something we've talked about as well is how often avoiding or reducing food waste aligns with business interests, and we've really seen that in the interviews
Yeah.
as well. Um, yeah.
one thing we've been doing on the denominator research side is trying to break down different agricultural industries or
Mhm.
agricultural supply chains into different phases. We have our farm, primary processors, secondary processors before we go out to distribution, just as broad categories. Do you, Gina, notice any parallels between different primary processors and different secondary processors, especially when it comes to splitting out maybe some of the causes, some of the common solutions, or the different things they may be considering? It seems like we have quite a few different causes and solutions, right? That are some may be shared, some may be quite different depending on what the um, specific company is doing, right, with the specific process they're working through. But I'm wondering if there are any parallels between sort of the stage these companies are at in the supply chain versus the specific
Mm.
action or the specific product they tried to make.
We've spoken to um, companies that make shelf-stable kind of um, bottled goods, for example, from fresh products, from fresh produce, um, and they actually buy from suppliers that everything pre-chopped, and so you might have thought that they would see some like a higher level of like higher loss rates there um, from processing those raw ingredients, but actually they that occurs higher in the supply chain because they buy everything pre-chopped. So there isn't a lot of loss that happens in those in their operations there.
The kind of loss is different. Maybe earlier on, large amounts of consistent, um, consistent byproduct, whereas later on, it's maybe more very different things. And maybe there's certain streams of loss that are more suited towards, say, going to animal feed, um, than or being turned into like upcycled back into the human supply chain, versus other things that after had more and more processing, it's maybe harder to recapture it. But we'd have to go back and think about that.
Right.
Yeah,
Um, that will be something hopefully we can answer by the end of this
yeah,
project.
Yeah.
that's a good question for us to bear in mind.
Yeah,
Yes.
I know we have quite a few different causes that we're looking at. I know, Gabrielle, that you've been working on a framework for that, right? Could you speak a
Well,
little
if
bit
we
more
have,
about
yeah,
that?
framework for causes and framework for solutions. On the solution side, um, the team did some research. It kind of took um, like dozens and dozens and dozens of different solutions that were either from literature that ReFed had published, other people had published, ideas that we had, and we kind of dumped them all together, and then we um, worked through a long process of sorting them and organizing them, to get them into about a dozen different categories, which are really aimed at the manufacturers and distributors, and kind of these are different ways you could approach reducing food loss in your operations, um, ways you could change your product, the packaging or the product itself in order to say extend the shelf life or avoid edible food going to waste down the line. There are ways you could change your um, inventory levels, how do you so that you better align supply with demand. You make what's really needed at the right times, at the right places. Um, Ways that you could ensure that the distribution chain has the best quality equipment and keeps things in the best condition, all the way down to the end of when you have product that's left over or food that cannot be sold through its primary channel. How do you make it available, sell it if you can, donate it if you can't, and try to keep as much in the human supply chain as possible? And in each of those areas, we have different specific um, ideas that they could kind of play around with or look at. And um, we are going to talk to more and more manufacturers about this and try to, see if this resonates with them. But hopefully it should be kind of a menu of options that ReFed could present to manufacturers and distributors and say, like, have you thought about all these different things? Some of them maybe you've thought about, some of them you haven't, or you do this, but maybe you could do it better. You could tighten it up and, use this strategy to drive down waste even more. So we're hoping those resonate with people.
Mm. What's the most innovative solution that you've
No.
come across?
There are some, like, cutting edge packaging things in the kind of material science realm, of, packaging that's made out of new kinds of materials or that has different kinds of, compounds that are, like, inserted into the packaging. I think those are some of the more innovative things. And then there's, things that are kind of old hat, like, let's say, they're like they've been done, they're widely done, but they're very effective, and if they could be done better, it would really help. So, I mean, a classic example there would be refrigeration. Like, everyone has a cold chain, and we're pretty good in the United States on that. However, not everyone is fantastic, and, there's definitely room for people to improve their buildings, improve their transportation infrastructure, invest more money in better refrigeration, modern equipment, more, um sensors and monitors that let you know when the temperature is not holding correctly. And we've heard that in some of our interviews of people who moved from an old building to a new building and said, well, the new refrigeration really helped with the shelf life. So that's kind of maybe a bit more boring and not as cutting edge, but is actually quite helpful.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
I'm trying to think, have we come across any cool examples of upcycling in our interviews so far?
I don't know if we have, but I know that's very
Well, the dairy,
sure.
I mean, the dairy producers talk about what they do with the whey.
Right.
They turn the whey into whey powder, um, and yeah,
Yeah, because that's quite an exciting solution that people are talking about at the moment
yeah.
in terms of the circular economy. Um, yeah, trying to take byproduct and make something edible out of it.
Yeah, you almost have to engineer you have to engineer the products together so that the byproduct of one becomes the basis of another, and then
Yeah.
these things have to kind of be designed
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, I think the dairy industry is a good example of that
Yes.
with whey. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the other byproducts often go to animal feed is what we
Yes, definitely a lot of animal feed. There's a lot of animals being fed
Yeah.
with manufactured waste.
Yes.
What are some of the um, biggest challenges? This is a big question. What are some of the biggest challenges in modeling the whole U.S. food system? No small feat. The whole, at least the whole U.S. food manufacturing and distribution sector.
I think
Um,
the two biggest challenges I would say is one, finding the right data, right?
yeah.
And luckily, I think we've been fortunate enough where I think USDA has been reporting on quite a few different things. And once we've understood to align ourselves against the agricultural supply chains versus, I think, some other categorization, right? It became much easier to procure the data we needed.
Mhm.
So once we had that, now what we're working through right now is trying to figure out, you know, uh, the numbers that we have here, right? Do they mean what we think they do? And that usually involves going through quite a bit of documentation, sometimes reaching out to the people who may not have written the reports, but are involved in the various agencies and familiar with the work itself. And so I think those two are probably the biggest challenges, I would say.
Yeah, and our strategy here is to take say, look, all the food that is manufactured in the United States is uh, comes from the agricultural sector or from imports,
Mhm.
and that's what goes into the manufacturing sector. So we're going to measure imports and production in all these different agricultural commodities, and then that's the volume of food that gets made. And then our challenge is to reflect the complexity of the transformation process that is at the heart of manufacturing, which adds weight and subtracts weight and
Yep.
transforms things from one state into another state and one category into another category. And our model is trying to do that,
Yep.
um, and to identify where that loss is and how much the weight of loss is
Yep.
on a national scale.
Yeah. I think the modeling aspect itself isn't too complex. It's really just really understanding what the values mean, right? And make sure they're applied in the right way, even if they may not always be attacking the same envelope or the numbers the same way. And so trying to stitch all of that together in a way that makes sense, is repeatable and is defensible. I think that's the real challenge.
what makes lid
Ah,
Mm.
the best position to tackle this problem?
well, the way I talked to Refed about it last year when we were discussing this project was that our clients are manufacturers and distributors, and we're in touch with the things that make them tick. What are their problems? What are the kinds of solutions they're investing in? Where are they spending their money on? Digital things like software, or physical infrastructure like buildings and equipment, and um, had and that we could understand the language of manufacturer distributors and speak to them in a language that resonates. I hope that's true, and that's been sort of the interviews that you're doing, Gina, are at the center of that strategy. That we're going to talk to a lot of people who are in this sector, and see what they're doing, and figure out how food loss and waste strategies can connect with investment ideas that they already have. We've found kind of in our work, based just on kind of our clientele and what they talk about, we do not find that food loss and waste is going to be the primary reason that a company is going to make a big investment in a change in their operation. But it could be a secondary, tertiary reason that really could be compelling. So that's, I think, a lot of what we want to do, especially on the solution side, is figure out how to tie these ideas into um, investment strategies that companies have to expand capacity, increase productivity, increase quality, and where is food loss and waste a piece of that puzzle, and how do we explain that to the manufacturers, distributors, and help them kind of maximize those investments in this regard. So we think we have our finger on the pulse of that sector, and yeah, so that's what we bring to this equation, is kind of that insight into the sector.
If people want to find out more about this, where do they go?
Oh, if people want to know, well, our work will eventually be published, I hope, on the Refed website, probably in 2026, I would say. Uh, and then we'll be at the Refed Summit in late June. We'll all be there.
Yeah.
We are really excited to talk to lots of people.
Yeah.
Our team will spread out and tell everyone about this work.